when we scroll down to the very bottom of this chapter, the fierce anger of the Lord will not turn back until he has performed and accomplished the intent of his heart. In the latter days, you will understand this. It even tells us, again, it uses those language of latter days. So when you're reading through these passages, for instance, I skipped over verse 23, but I should have read it. Behold, the tempest of the Lord, wrath has gone forth. These are future-facing passages that on the near aspect, God poured out judgment on Babylon for exiling Jerusalem. And we're talking about the 5th and 6th century Neo-Babylon that Nebuchadnezzar headed up. God judged Babylon then by allowing the Medes and the Persians to overthrow them. And we're going to read about that when we start getting into the book of Daniel and reading about Nebuchadnezzar's statue and Daniel's visions of the 4 beasts. Babylon was overthrown by the Medes and the Persians. And that was God's way of judging Babylon, in one sense for the way she treated Israel, and in another sense because she was full of wickedness herself and was ripe for judgment. But on the other hand, the judgment that's described in the prophets isn't total. All of the language has not been exhausted on Babylon in terms of judgment, which tells us that there's a future Babylon that's going to exist someday, whether it's a literal Babylon, the city, or it's a personification of Babylon as is represented by other cities that don't necessarily have the name Babylon, but personify the same wickedness. In other words, we're talking about spiritual entities, spiritual wickedness, right? Not necessarily that it has to be the same geographical location on planet Earth where ancient Babylon once stood. But the point I'm trying to make is the language of the prophecies that we read help us to understand that there's a future judgment that's coming that will be total. It'll be final. And when we get to the book of Revelation, this will be spelled out, particularly in the latter parts of Revelation, like chapter 17, 18, 19, things like that. All right, so moving straight from Jeremiah 30, where it talks about the day of the Lord and the wrath that's going to go out and the fierce anger of the Lord will not turn back. Right, we jump right from that into Jeremiah 31. Israel's mourning turned to joy at that time. What time? The time we just read about in Jeremiah 30. Remember, the prophecies were written originally without these chapter breaks and verse breaks. So we're meant to read the prophecies back to back, kind of page by page. So that's why I just did a seamless transition from chapter 31 in chapter 30 into the verse chapter 31, as if they were still put together on Jeremiah's scroll, because originally they were. At that time, what time? The time near the times of judgment, or the day of the Lord. Declares the Lord, I will be the God of all the families of Israel, and they shall be my people. This is what the Lord says. The people who survived the sword and found grace in the wilderness, Israel, when it went to find its rest. The Lord appeared to him long ago, saying, I've loved you with an everlasting love, therefore I've drawn you out with kindness. I will build you again, and you will be rebuilt. Notice that language of being rebuilding and restoration, right? And forgiveness and mercy being poured out is only to those whom God is in covenant with. This means personally, on the personal level, it's if you have a relationship with Yeshua. But nationally, we see this being poured out to Israel only. In other words, this language is not poured out to Babylon, to the Babylons of this world, or the Egypts of this world, or things like that, the evil beast systems that Satan controls and has been controlling down to the ages, and utilizing those beast systems to persecute Israel or her temple or the Jewish people or the law of God or the Messiah, Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, Rome, and then the 7th empire, and then the 8th empire, if you follow that language from Daniel. Those beast empires all have something in common. They hate God, they hate God's Messiah, they hate God's righteous ways, meaning his laws, his Torah. They hate God's people, God's city, God's temple, God's commandments. They hate all that is, and when I say they, it's because they are being controlled by the beast himself, which is ultimately Satan. So this idea in Jeremiah 31 that God says, I will build you again, that language is reserved for God's people. On the natural level, that's Israel and Zion and Jerusalem. On the spiritual level, this is the church or those who are in relationship with God, if you genuinely have a relationship with Yeshua. So that language is helpful because Jeremiah 31, as many of you know, if I scroll all the way down, keep scrolling to verse 31, Verse 27, behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will sow the house of Israel and the house of Judah with the seed of mankind and the seed of animals, and just as I've watched over them to uproot them, right, the exile and the ultimate tribulation that's coming, tear them down, ruin, destroy, and bring disaster on them, so I will watch over them to build and to plant them, declares the Lord. Notice those dual themes again in both the prophets and in what we're going to be reading about when we get to the New Testament and book of Revelation. The idea of there's judgment, exile, punishment, but then there's restoration. On the near term, this was Israel going into exile in the 5th, 6th centuries. Ultimately, it started with the Assyrian exile in the 720s, but then nearly 200 years later, Babylon came and exiled Judah. So judgment took place for God's people. She was exiled. Jerusalem was destroyed, plowed under. The temple was destroyed, etc., but God promises to restore. In those days, let me jump down to verse 31, the familiar passage that's the longest single running quote from the Old Testament into the New in the book of Hebrews, chapters 8 and chapter 10 of Hebrews. Behold, days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah. There are no languages that show up in the Tanakh anywhere that God says, I'll make a new covenant with the house of Babylon and with the house of Egypt, and the house of Edom, and with the house of fill in the blank for whatever beast system that you can think of at the moment. God doesn't make renewed covenants or new covenants with those wicked beast systems. Why? Because he's not in covenant with them to begin with. Can those people groups be saved if they turn from their wickedness and turn to God and trust in his Messiah? Absolutely. Salvation and the gospel is open to everyone, right? For God so loved the entire world, not just Israel only. But the point we're trying to make is that there's this exclusive covenant relationship that God makes with his bride based on the covenants that he established with the forefathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And this language is what the prophets pick up on. I'll make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah. So that's the restoration. Why is that important? Again, when we get to the book of Revelation, we're trying to ascertain who's who are God's people and who are the wicked systems, right? Who's Babylon and who's Jerusalem, and which side do you want to be on? Which city do you want to associate with? It's helpful that these themes that we're already reading about that are already dominant, they're not even side issues, they're dominant. They pervade the Tanakh. If you're not getting anything from this perspective that we're looking through the Old Testament, please don't miss this, right? God has a covenant with his people. On the natural level, this means Israel, but on the spiritual level, this means the church. Again, this does not mean that every single Israelite is going to be saved spiritually. It just means they are the type and shadow of the covenant people group of God. Sadly, 2/3 of them are going to go through the tribulation and lose their lives, as far as I can ascertain. And that's God's people that God's allowing Satan to destroy and to kill and to murder and to martyr. So, and it's again for the purpose of refining that 1/3 and bringing them through the fire, through the testing, so that they can be brought to their knees and meet their Messiah and confess him as Lord, and then go on into the millennial kingdom and start that whole program up. So that's Jeremiah 31, right? A familiar passage. But let's keep moving on. In Zephaniah, we have prophecies that talk again about the exile and the punishment that's about to befall Israel because of her wickedness, because of her idolatry, because of her playing the harlot. She is the primary harlot that's described in the Old Testament because she is the only bride of God that's described in the Old Testament. So it's coincidental language when we talk about the harlotry language of Israel coincides with the bridal language of Israel. That's the coincidence between the two. That's not meant to make us think that Israel is the only harlot. Indeed, the wicked surrounding nations, we're going to see this when we turn to the New Testament here shortly, the surrounding nations, and indeed all the nations of the earth, at the end of the age are swept up in idolatry, even though they're not the bride of God, even though they're not typified in the Old Testament as the people of God. They're still swept up at the end of the day in the wickedness, in the wicked idolatrous systems and the false religions and all of the murder and the intense. I'm losing terminology here. All of the a love for money and all of the everything that goes along with that whole let's just live for today system. I'm going to be my own person. What we call man's theology, man's religion. secular humanism and atheism and all of that whole liberal perspective where anything goes. Let's just do it your own way. Be your own man, be your own God. You're the Messiah, you're the Buddha, you're the Christ, you're the Muhammad, you are your own savior. The whole New Age system and all false religions that are tied into that and stuff. The whole system of wickedness is going to be judged, and we're going to see this here in a moment. But woe to Jerusalem and the nations. Woe to Jerusalem and the nations. And so God judges anyone who's wicked, but he restores his people. He restores those who are in covenant relationship with him. Again, on the natural level, this is typified by Israel, right, who remains despite her judgments, right? There are wicked nations in the earth that have basically gone out of existence, right? You go back into the Old Testament, the 5 books of Moses, and you read about all those ites, right? The Hittites, the Jebusites, the Girgashites, the all these other ites that Joshua had to deal with when he went into the land of Canaan. And many of those ites don't exist anymore. Why? They passed on into obscurity. Why? Because they were not in covenant relationship with God. There's no more mention of these people groups. They've been swallowed up into the sands of history, right? Or they got assimilated into other groups and there's no more of them. God judges them, right? The Sodomites. You ever met a Sodomite today? I mean, like as in someone from Sodom? Ever met a Gomorrite? I don't even know how you would say that. Someone from Sodom and Gomorrah? As in, that was their birthplace. Why? No, you haven't met these people. Why? Because God judged that wicked city, Sodom and Gomorrah, and he turned it into a smoking ash heap, and it basically remains that way to this day. And so that's the way we are to read these prophecies. God judges wicked systems, and in some cases, he wipes them off the map. But Israel will not be wiped out. Ultimately, she'll be judged. Lots of inhabitants within her will die and perish at the sword at God's judgment, but ultimately God will restore those whom he's preserved, and he will not wipe them out completely because he made covenant promises to them. So woe to Jerusalem and the nations. We see that in the book of Zephaniah. And so basically the entire book of Zephaniah is about the day of the Lord. But when you scroll down to verse 12 of Zephaniah 3, a remnant of Israel, but I will leave among you a humble and lowly people, and they will take refuge in the name of the Lord. Again, that remnant language is for Israel exclusively. He doesn't leave remnants of the nations because of the covenant relationship that he has with them. There's no covenant relationship with them. They must find their place among Israel if they want to be protected and restored and blessed in any sort of way. That's why they are grafted into Israel at those levels. That's why they become a part of the people of God and they're given the label Israel. And that's the paradigm that we see over and over again. When God rescued Israel out of Egypt, and there were a bunch of mixed multitude peoples that left Egypt that day, a lot of Egyptians that placed their trust in Moses instead of Pharaoh, and a lot of other people groups that were subjugated by the pharaohs of that day, they got out of Egypt when the time came, right? They saw the scorecard, the 10 plagues, and they're like, Moses 10, Pharaoh 0. Okay, let's go with Moses, right? Or let's go with God. So they got out of Egypt that day when the Exodus took place. But they all gathered at the foot of Sinai, this mixed multitude, and then God started speaking to them collectively as Israel. Did they convert? Well, the rabbis say they did, but I don't believe they did. I don't believe they converted and became Jewish. Instead, it's the type and shadow, the paradigm of people being brought into the people of God by their faith in God. They still retain their national identification as someone from the surrounding nations coming into the nation of Israel ethnically, but spiritually speaking or covenantally speaking, they take on the label of Israel as a people group. And thus the same is true today. If you name the name of Yeshua as Messiah, then spiritually speaking, you're part of the spiritual nation of God, the spiritual nation of Israel. You're spiritual Israelites, you're spiritual sons and daughters of Abraham. Abraham is your father. Don't believe me? You can just go ask Paul, right? He tells us in Romans chapter 3 and Galatians chapter 4 that Abraham is your papa if you believe in Yeshua. So Because of that, you're grafted into Israel. Read Romans chapter 11 all over again. You're the spiritual people of Israel. You don't have to be ethnically Jewish to be part of the spiritual people of Israel. So the remnant of Israel is that group of people who's preserved by God. God alone preserves and protects them and ultimately restores and continues to rebuild the people from there. So that's Zephaniah chapter 3. Now, with the next 20 minutes in front of us, let's continue to, well, we've got one more Old Testament book, sorry. Zechariah 14 is one classic Old Testament prophetic book that talks about the God protecting Israel. And the language that's in this final chapter of Zechariah is almost universally understood to be eschatological, end time. In other words, there's no preterist perspective here in this particular prophecy. This doesn't seem to have been fulfilled at some time in historic past because the language doesn't allow it. And now again, maybe a full preterist out there listening to this commentary, watching this video is going to say, no, I disagree with you, Ariel. All of this Zechariah 14 language was fulfilled sometime, and he's going to quote X amount of historical occurrence or whatever. Okay, yeah, he's probably going to be that way. But even most contemporary rabbis agree that this is all future-facing language. And certainly Christians who name the name of Yeshua believe that the language here, when Zechariah talks about the feet of God standing on the Mount of Olives, is actually Yeshua standing there. If not, it's anthropomorphic language talking about God himself. But notice, I won't read all of this, but just a few verses. Behold, a day is coming. Again, notice the language. Behold, a day is coming. That language is typically hinting at and cluing you into the fact that this is eschatological, day of the Lord, future from the time period of the prophet, without necessarily a near time fulfillment such as 70 AD. Rather, instead, it's more far-facing. Although, let me make this clarifier. The day of the Lord language that shows up in the Old Testament that we've been looking at and pouring through, that we're going to finish up with tonight, the day of the Lord language has its limited application in whatever exile takes place at Israel's historical place on the timeline. So whether that would have been Babylon exile or Assyrian exile or Babylonian exile or the Roman exile in the first century, all of those have day of the Lord aspects that are borrowed from the prophets that the prophecies could be applied to, because we're talking about judgment, exile, destruction of Jerusalem language, all that type of thing. And that's day of the Lord language as well. But the point I'm trying to bring up is that if you continue to follow through with all the day of the Lord language and notice how it talks about the finality of the judgment against the nations and the finality of the judgment against Israel, meaning the final judgment, and then the bringing in of everlasting righteousness, i.e. an age where God will usher in a kingdom of righteousness that his son is going to rule over, right? Daniel chapter 7 and things like that. Then we begin to realize that the day of the Lord is describing an event in the future that is a culmination. It's designed to be fullness. The day of the Lord theme is not designed to be some reusable, recyclable prophecy that's just used over and over and over again in every generation where Israel finds herself in playing time out. That's not the way the phrase day of the Lord is meant to be understood. The day of the Lord is meant to be just that. Not a literal day, but an epoch, a time period, an age, a culmination, a fullness at the end of the age, a final judgment, a fullness, a zenith, a filling up, a harvest, a reaping, a final judgment. That's what day of the Lord language is designed to be understood at. Don't think of the day of the Lord as something that's just recyclable over and over again whenever Israel finds herself being punished by God. For instance, was the Holocaust the day of the Lord judgment by God? Well, it was definitely a cruel punishment at the hands of a beast-type nation, right? The Nazi regime and Hitler and all of that stuff. But the point I'm trying to make is that it doesn't seem to fulfill and exhaust all of the day of the Lord language that we read about, and that we're indeed going to be reading about in the book of Revelation soon. So the day of the Lord, a day is coming when the spoils will be taken from you and divided among you, for I will gather all the nations against Jerusalem to battle, and the city will be taken, the houses plundered, the women raped, and half the city exiled, but the rest of the people will not be eliminated from the city. So we're talking about a destruction of Jerusalem, a siege, a besieging, an attack on Jerusalem from surrounding nations. Is it the nations that immediately surround Israel, right? Like Egypt and Jordan and and Turkey and Iraq and Saudi Arabia and Lebanon and is it those immediate cities that surround Jerusalem that are like on the same land mass as Israel? In some cases, it does describe those. Other times, it talks about the surrounding nation. It talks the language as if all the nations of the world are gathered against Israel. Right? Even like people who are on other continents are going to war against Israel. Right? Sometimes that's the language that's being described. So the point being is that if we look at this as a future prophecy, notice that God fights for Israel. He stands on Jerusalem. He stands on the Mount of Olives, right? His feet will stand on the Mount of Olives, verse 4. Has that ever happened yet? Not physically, not literally. So we can see this language, if we're going to take it literal, that this must be a future-facing prophecy that Christians would say, if we're talking about the feet of God, we're talking about Yeshua, unless we're talking about an extreme theophany again. But nevertheless, his feet will stand on the Mount of Olives, right? And blah, blah, blah. And we scroll down, and it talks about God will be king over all, the Lord will be king over all the earth, and on that day the Lord will be the only one, his name the only one. I'll change the land will change into a plain from Geba to Rimmon, south of Jerusalem, but Jerusalem will rise and remain on its site from Benjamin's gate, as far as the place from the far gate to the corner gate, right? People will live in it, and there will no longer be a curse, for Jerusalem will live in security. And then the language that follows from 12 to the end of the chapter, all the way to the very end, it cannot possibly be something that's happened historically, because it talks about a temple and it talks about people coming up and worshiping at the Feast of Booths, and if they don't come up, there'll be no rain. Partially fulfilled in the first century, and the temple was rebuilt from Zechariah's perspective. All people did stream into Jerusalem year after year, especially during the festivals, and participated in the feast to some degree. But the punishments that were described in this chapter weren't meted out the way that they are described here. So we can see this as future facing in its total fulfillment. All right,